Welcome, everyone, to today's session on the role of strategic foresight in governance. We're going to cover quite a bit of ground in the next 30 minutes, and we're going to talk about the value of strategic foresight in the governance process. We're going to go through what is strategic foresight. We're going to talk about a strategic foresight project we've done here at VRSA this year called VRSA 2030, and we'll have a wrap up with some resources, and then we'll move into our live Q&A. So it's April of 2021. And local governments, public entities around the country, and the pools that insure them are dealing with a host of significant challenges and issues that need to be worked through in the next few years that are really going to fundamentally change the landscape of the country. Take any one of these things and they're significant, and when you put them all together, they just really are the definition of what's called a VUCA environment, and that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That is the perfect environment to focus on strategic foresight. We right now are doing a lot of reacting, doing a lot of figuring out what to do next, how to meet a lot of pressing needs on the part of members. And this is an opportunity to pick your head up from the sidewalk and look beyond the current situation and consider your organization's future. So what's the value of having strategic foresight as a part of your process? I think first and foremost, it will elevate your discussion at your board and committee meetings. There are three phases, I guess, of governance. There is the generative thinking, the strategic discussion and planning, and then there is the fiduciary oversight. We spend a lot of time on fiduciary oversight, and this is an opportunity to really change the tenor of your discussions, to have more meaningful discussions. What are the right questions to be asking? What are the potential things we should be planning for? Strategic foresight is about opening up your lens deeper and wider into the future and how things may unfold that will impact your organization or community. You're going to have more innovative discussion, and that's going to lead to more innovative policies. And you'll be surprised what kinds of things come out of a project that you had not considered. And then we talk about future proofing. This is really stress testing. Strategic foresight can be used for any number of things. It can be used to test an idea or a product or a service. It doesn't just have to be the future of pooling or the future of your pool or the future of local government, for example. Lastly, and probably most important, it's a way to engage stakeholders. We'll talk about this in the context of VRSA 2030, but as the CEO of a pool, my job is to create a vision and get people to believe in it. That can be a challenge, and certainly we could all do a better job of articulating and communicating vision. But strategic foresight project can really help people create a common shared vision and really bring your staff together. And certainly has done that in our case at a time in 2020 where we sent everybody home virtually, and we were very concerned about creeping back into the siloed approach that we had years ago that we worked so hard to tear down. But the Foresight project was the perfect opportunity to get a lot of people engaged, especially when they were at home working virtually. All right, we'll start with the definition. Strategic foresight is a systematic approach, and systematic means it's embedded into your operations year-round. It's where we look beyond current expectations. We consider a broad variety of plausible developments that could happen. We consider the impacts of those potential developments, and we look at what we can do to make it better. Is it the same thing as strategic planning? It's a good companion to strategic planning, and it has some similarities. I personally think it's a critical foundation for strategic planning, and really would not want to go through a strategic planning process again without doing a strategic foresight work on the front end. And so strategic plan, most of you are, I'm sure, are familiar with. It typically builds forward from today. You've got a plan and what's going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years. That sort of process tends to keep us on our current trajectory unless there's some reason we have to change. We tend to do the SWOT analysis, which is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And that's really focusing on what's in front of you today. What are the emerging opportunities and threats, or rather, what are the current opportunities and threats that are here right now? And then typically that's done at an annual retreat or every 5-year retreat with an outside facilitator, maybe an annual update with your board, maybe periodically you'll receive reports. Strategic foresight is a little different. First of all, it looks at the time horizon is much longer. 10 years is usually a minimum. It can go out much further than that depending on the nature of the project and the domain or what's being studied. 10 years feels really good for me and for pools, I think, because the technology out 20 and 30 years is so unknowable that it makes it much more difficult. I think 10 years is a reasonable horizon to sort of get you beyond anything your organization is facing today. You can get beyond it if you're looking 10 years out. We talked about shining a light on plausible futures. Plausible is a word you're going to hear more than once throughout this, and I'll get to that in a slide here in a minute. We want to focus on emerging opportunities and threats with strategic foresight. What's next, not what's right in front of us. And then lastly, it's embedded. I mentioned that before as a part of your ongoing processes. So what do we mean by plausible futures? If you take a look at the graph, there are a few things to note. Obviously at the left we have now, and on the right we have 10 years out. The future certainly is much less certain 10 years out. It's not certain at all, in fact. And so there's a wide range of potential things that could happen in the coming decade for your community, your pool, your state, for example. I mentioned in strategic planning this continuity assumption where we tend to move toward our expected future unless there's some reason to change. Strategic foresight, though, compels you to look at other outcomes that could happen that are plausible outcomes, not science fiction, but plausible outcomes. And maybe there's some alternative choices that will be more appealing than the expected future that you're headed toward. Okay, so the strategic foresight process. There are a number of different versions of this. This is a 6-step process that AGRIP uses. I mentioned the first step is about framing your domain. So if you're going to tackle a strategic foresight exercise or project, you're going to need to define what it is you're interested in. In our case, we did the future of the Virginia Risk Sharing Association in 2030. That was our domain. The second step is scanning for forces and trends. And this is when you're going to begin to assemble your pool data. So a lot of people use STEEP or steeple analysis, which looks at societal, technological, economic, environmental, political, and legal trends. And you can begin to piece together information from various sources on that and use that to sort of look at what the future might look like. Step 3 is the heart of the project. And that is about forecasting scenarios, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that. And then step 4 is when you begin to envision the future. So after you've forecasted a number of alternative scenarios, you're going to begin to look at, well, what's the one we like the best, or what attributes from different ones do we like the best, and you begin to envision the future you want. So this is when we begin to turn idea into action. Then we move into step 5, which is called backcasting. Unlike strategic planning where we say, okay, we got a goal in 5 years, so here's the steps we're going to do to get there. This is, if we want to achieve this by 2030, what are the high-level milestones we need to achieve in, say, 28, 26, 24, and 22 in order to make that happen. And then the last step, of course, is implementation. What do we need to start doing now to move our organization toward our preferred future? Well, now let's talk about the VRSA 2030 project. We involved 18 staff as well as our board. I have 55 total staff, 18 of them. And the project started in July of 2020 and ended in February of 2021. So it really was born out of our board meeting in February of 2020. And we had 3 board members retiring in June, and we were talking about 3 of our 9 board members leaving and another 2 to 3 expected to retire in the next 2 to 3 years, and how that was going to profoundly change the pool. And those people leaving had average tenures of about 15 years. At that same meeting, we were discussing that, and I happened to have prepared this chart, which shows our staff, those reaching age 65 between 2020 and 2030. And we have 26 of 55 of us, including me, doing that. We decided, a lot's going to change in the next 10 years, but just because of succession planning. And so we need to start thinking about that. So I contacted my friend and mentor, Rebecca Ryan, and said we were interested in doing that project, and VRSA 2030 was born. Again, we framed the domain, and we decided the future of VRSA in 2030. And then we decided to set step 2 for scanning and forces and trends. I mentioned that people use STEEP or steeple analysis. We chose to use our enterprise risk management quadrant matrix. We've embedded enterprise risk management into our operations and thought this would be a good opportunity to show the board something familiar and to embed it along with our enterprise risk management processes. So in ERM, the 4 quadrants are strategic risk, which are things that arise out of society and the economy, and they're generally things that you can't control. Financial risk, of course, you're familiar with, principally investments, but probably more importantly for most pools is your underwriting and your claim reserving risk. If you've done any kind of target equity study, you'll appreciate how significant those are. And then, of course, we have the reinsurance market, which right now is just nuts. Then we move down to the lower left. We have operations risk, which is really your people, processes, and systems. Lots of stuff covered there. If you are familiar with enterprise risk management, the fourth quadrant where I have membership risk usually says hazard risk. And that's about placing different insurance coverages. Given that I'm responsible for that, I move that into operations risk because that's a people risk. And then we changed it to membership risk because of the profound impact that things happening to our members can have on us. And part of that, if you can imagine, a big insurance company writes all over the country, let's say, or all over the world, and they write local governments and restaurants and hotels and any other kind of business you can think of. They have tremendous diversification and spread of risk. Pools don't have that. We write one thing, public entities in one state. That does present some considerable risks. All right, now we get in, as I mentioned, to the scenarios part or the storytelling part of this exercise. And we chose for our project to use a futuring tool or strategic foresight tool called Explore Alternative Futures. You can see on the graph here that there are really three futures that this exercise suggests that we look at. The first is expected. So what is our general trajectory, our continuity assumption? Then we have a challenging scenario where everything goes wrong. And then we have, of course, an aspirational or visionary scenario. Now, for VRSA 2030, we tweaked this a little bit, and we decided to do 2 aspirational stories, so 4 stories in total. And we did that. We wanted the aspirationals to be one that emanated from an external force and one from an internal force. And we did that because when you're doing this work for aspirational, we tend to focus on what we can control, and we wanted to make sure that we recognized that something, for example, there could be legislation passed that presents us an opportunity to provide new coverage tools or resources. I mentioned storytelling, scenario writing. This is all just the meat of the project. And there are ways to write good scenarios, and there are ways to write bad scenarios. These are stories that are written from the vantage point of the future. So when a reader's looking at it, it's 2030, and they're reading about what happened over that decade that ended up either a challenging, expected, or aspirational future. What's important is that reader really get a feel for what it's like to be in that future. So we want to show the dynamics of that future world and what it feels like to be a person in that world. So this is a little bit of creative writing for those that enjoy that. It does need to be based on evidence from drivers, trends, signals, and other research. You certainly want to stretch your mind to again, that possible versus plausible, and really to tease that and decide which category it falls in as far as a credible story or a future. The other is it needs to be logically coherent and internally consistent. So where the external events make sense and how they interact. When you are writing a bad scenario, this is the kind of things that you don't want to see in scenarios. There's no magic bullets. There's whether that's aliens or technology. There's no kumbaya. There's no making the world in your own way you want it to be. It's got to be well thought out and based on facts and trends and forces. There are generally 4 kinds of stories that get written or scenarios, and the 4 are the growth, constraint, collapse, and transformation. Growth, again, is just the expected. Constraint is when something that's a core guiding value or purpose, something changes that changes your behavior, governs your behavior or your organization's behavior. And then we have collapse, which is the rapid catastrophic breakdown of systems, and then transformation, where we come out of that. All right, so our specific scenarios in the VRSA 2030 project, they're each 4 to 5 pages long, I should mention, and but I boiled down here sort of the gist of the story. So the expected future in scenario 1, we sort of said, hey, there's going to be 2 to 4 years of fiscal stress coming from the pandemic. This is before we knew about, of course, any election, before we knew about stimulus money, before any of that. So we figured they'd have moderate fiscal stress, a little worse than the 2008 downturn, and that we would use our surplus to maintain stable rates and see everybody through that. Scenario 2 was challenging, and it was about local governments having severe fiscal stress, which led to more price sensitivity, which cost us members, which led to staff turnover, et cetera. And then we had our 2 aspirational scenarios. I mentioned an example, a legislative change that could offer us an opportunity to provide a new coverage resource or tool. And then, of course, our internal scenario is the one we really want as a team. This is our common vision, We want to be a model organization using strategic foresight, strategic planning, and enterprise risk management to create, I guess, what I would call anticipatory governance for VRSA and this organization. And then, of course, lastly, we want to make sure we get the succession planning right. That was also in scenario 4. So now we've written our stories, and those have been honed and edited and rethought and argued about, and we've gotten the stories like we want them. And then we move on to step 2, and this is really critical. This is when we begin to take ideas and turn them into action. We're going to now go to the stories, and we're going to look at what are the levers, what are the things that we can do, what strategies can we deploy to change the outcome or impact the outcome of that particular story. So we divided up into 4 teams. We had one working on each story, and they looked at what are these strategies that we can find, that we can implement to impact this future. And each team did that independently. Then we paired 2 teams up, 2 sets of 2 teams for round 2, and we looked for crossover levers, what works in either story. And then for the 3rd and final round, we pulled all 4 teams together and looked for crossover levers that worked in at least 3 of the stories and preferably 4. And so through all of that, we came up with these 5 strategies, and they are to improve member engagement through the elevation of the discussion of risk. We want to allow greater flexibility in how funds may be used to meet member needs. We can use surplus strategically to provide adequate coverage and stable rates. We can bolster our service reputation and our commitment to service. We can advance strategies to ensure smooth succession planning. Each of these 5 strategies had at least 5 specific actions under each one that could be taken. So these were the strategic themes, and then the specific actions were developed for each one. And I'm going to show you, I won't go through all 5, but I'm going to show you an example just for strategy 1, improve member engagement. And so we came up with these 5 actions, which was harnessing our message to focus on why, so we can make this emotional connection with people. Instead of reporting on, for example, like how many claims did we have last quarter, maybe we should be focusing on how many people we got back to work last quarter. We want to utilize Insight Decisions. That's an enterprise risk management software tool that we co-developed with a pool out in Oregon. It's a perfect tool for group decision making, and we're hoping that our members will embrace the use of that. It's free for them, of course. We want to monitor and inform on relevant legislation and the impact of that legislation on members and potentially the pool. We want to promote thought leadership and provide training regularly on emerging risks. So we, for example, this year have implemented 2 different things, emerging risk alerts in our emerging risk series. The series is more lower velocity, 12 to 36 month horizon before something happens. The big one in our state right now is marijuana legalization. We're working on that. And then I mentioned emerging risk alerts are really more like high velocity, quick, next 6 months. We need to make you aware this is happening, what the potential impact is. And then the last one, we have had so much success with this, facilitate roundtables. One of the best things that came out of 2020 for us was virtual engagement with our members. Our engagement numbers are through the roof. It's obviously a lot more efficient to have 4 virtual meetings and to drive 4 hours and have 1 meeting and drive home. Really, the magic has been getting our small groups of members together for us just to listen to. And whether we talked about COVID protocols, whether we talked about social justice movement, whether we talked about various police issues that were going on here in Virginia, these were opportunities to get people around the table and working together and working with VRSA and to help us develop tools, resources, et cetera, to help meet their needs. We then also asked everyone to look at 2 questions. What does surprising success look like? And then how do we measure it? And so the first are more visionary and aspirational. And so you can see a couple there that in 2030, we would hope that enterprise risk management framework was embedded in most of our large members due to our assistance in launching ERM and doing the program building. And then participation by leadership of our members in our various training and educational opportunities to a greater degree than they participate today. But then once we get beyond aspirational, we want to know how do we measure this? And this is really about KPIs, key performance indicators. And so how are we going to measure and report on it? How are we going to know whether we've been successful? And so in 2030, we want 75% of our member chief appointed officials to attend at least 3 engagements a year. That becomes a measurable goal that we can work toward. Now it's time we get feedback from the governing body. The governing body was involved in the VRSA 2030 project on the front end as we went through that enterprise risk management quadrant matrix. And we helped identify all of those various concerns in a big spreadsheet. The staff took over from there and began all the scenarios, writing, and that kind of work. And now it's time to go back to the board. We did this in February of 21 and asked them these questions. So about the 4 scenarios or 4 futures, what resonated is essentially what we've asked. What scares you, excites you? Do you find them plausible? And then about the 5 strategies, we were looking for more specific feedback in terms of, again, what resonates. And then what's a green light? What are you ready to commit to? And what's a yellow light? What do you need more information? Or if it's a red light, we don't like this at all. We didn't have any of those, fortunately. On strategy 1, several board members commented that this was going to be the foundation for achieving the other strategies, which was, again, to improve member engagement by elevating the discussion of risk. Strategy 2 about flexibility and how funds may be used. We've talked about things like loans, and of course we have a grant program, and we've talked about things like group purchasing or sponsoring a data center for small members that aren't able to do that themselves. Board members like the fact it was out of the box and thinking more about efficiency and how we can do things, which of course is a goal of strategic foresight, to be thinking a little out of the box. Strategy 3 was about using surplus strategically to provide adequate coverage and stable rates. This was an interesting one because there was nothing about that was concerning to the board. It's really how we operate. But it was concerning one of the specific actions we had under there, and it was looking for expanded business opportunities and additional revenue streams. And this was about a concern, like I mentioned, we've developed a software with another pool. We've actually developed 2 or 3 software applications that could be sold. And, the board rightfully would say, hey, is that going to be mission creep and distracting from what we're here about, what our core mission is? Strategy 4 was bolstering our reputation by leveraging our commitment to service. And a lot of the discussion about this was recognizing that our members are also having turnover. Elected officials are serving shorter terms. Lots of people that have been around a long time in Virginia are retiring, both at the senior management level and the governing level. And the conversation was about the need to be very consistent and purposeful in our messaging to make sure that people understand who we are and what we're about as new people come and go. And they don't just focus on price over value and think we're just an insurance company. And then strategy 5, you can see the word aggressively is in big bold letters there. This was about succession planning, that it was imperative that we do it because we can't leave VRSA with a board that's not sufficiently knowledgeable. With that, we were able to move into our backcasting and implementation phases. Backcasting, as I mentioned, you look at 2030 and say, this is what we want to achieve. What by 28, 26, 24, and 22 will we need to have achieved? High level, not specifics yet. And then that moves you really into strategic planning, more traditional strategic planning mode, where you're doing your strategy roadmaps and action plans, developing your SMART goals and your key performance indicators. Then you roll up your sleeves and do the hard work of implementing. That project went from August until February. That was a heavy lift and a lot of man hours. And so if you're a little overwhelmed at the thought of that, take some comfort if you're a governing official that your staff does a lot of the heavy lifting here. But there also are some simple strategic foresight tools that I'm going to walk you through right now that you could do at your next board meeting. The first tool is called Look Backward to Look Forward. History is full of repeating patterns, and there's a lot of value in looking at that. So let's say your domain is your pool. I would want to go back probably twice as far as I'm looking forward. So I'd want to go back 20 years and look at the things that impacted the pool throughout that 20 years that still may have an impact going forward. Choosing your topic for historical input. Let's use your pool as the example. The time scale, I mentioned go back twice as far. And then step 3. So you're going to have each person write down the specific moments of change on a sticky note where something happened that was a meaningful change in that 20-year horizon for your organization. Everybody's going to take their sticky notes and put them on a timeline chart. So you'll say, like, when did all that happen during the 20 years? Then as a group, you'll want to talk through what were the most important drivers of change that impacted your pool, let's say. And then you can discuss the future you see emerging as you work toward that and looking at how those trends may continue. So that's an easy one you can do. All right, our next tool, this is kind of a fun one. It's called the Futures Triangle tool. And here you're going to be looking at 3 different things. 1 is the pull of the future. 2 is the push of the present. And 3 is the weight of the past. What's pulling us to the future, what's pushing us from the present, and what's holding us back. You're going to define the future. That's always step 1. Step Two is when you're going to take those three areas and you can have people write down in sticky notes, what are the things that happen that are part of each of those three different categories? What's pulling us to the future? What's pushing us from the present? And what's holding us back? And then as a group, you'll decide. You might move things from one area to the other. This is a good exercise you'll note in step 4 there, where we talk about possible futures versus plausible futures. And this is a good exercise for really testing that. All right, so this is kind of the meat of it here. So pull of the future. These are some good questions that you can ask just one of these or all of these at your next board meeting. Do we have a shared image of the logic behind how the future gets formed in this specific case, or do we have competing logical beliefs? What does that really mean? They're different ideas about how the future may unfold. Let's hear them. Let's get them on the table. Let's talk them through, and let's prepare. I love the third question on the list. If we were adrift in a river, where do we end up on this issue? If we don't do anything, where are we in 10 years on this? I think that's a really good conversation starter. Then we move on to the push of the present. What trends and technologies are changing the future right now? Well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about virtual conferences and virtual meetings. What things are pushing change forward? Work from home as an example, downtown real estate. I mean, there are lots of things that are pushing us toward the future. And then what's already known that's happening that'll drive us forward. This is a really good one. Way to the past. What's holding us back? Who benefits from the status quo or loses if we change? Because there always are winners and losers in change. And then what are our barriers? What's holding us back or getting in the way? And what are the deep structures? What are our sacred cows that are preventing us from moving forward? So that's a really good conversation exercise that you can have. And then here's the third one I'll go through. It's called the Draw Out Consequences tool. It's an order of impact exercise if you've ever done that. You can pull something out of your pull from the future or pull of the future exercise, or it can be your current strategy that you're looking at. And so you want to say, okay, let's take our statement, let's take a critical action in one sentence that assumes success, and we write that in the middle. And then we talk about what's the first order consequence if that happens. And then, of course, we go through what's the second and third order consequences, and you will eventually create a scenario of a preferred future if you continue that exercise. So those are 3 simple looks at futuring or strategic foresight exercises that you can do in a fairly short period of time. I want to leave you with a few things, and that's some core principles for futures thinking or for strategic foresight. The first one is really important, and it's forget about predictions. When I'm explaining what strategic foresight is to people, the first thing about it, the joke is usually about predicting the future. Predicting the future tends to focus you on one outcome, and that's exactly the opposite of what strategic foresight is meant to do by opening up your lens to be deeper and wider than just the expected future. I mentioned look backward to see forward in our strategic foresight tool that I left you with a minute ago. And then it's focusing on signals and uncovering patterns that link signals. This one really is important. Signals are data points. You want to think of this as sort of like waves and tides. So data points are like waves. They pop up all over the place, but it's really the tide. It's the force underneath that's propelling the change. So we want to try to take those data points and link them and see if there's some signal in there that can turn into a trend that can have an impact. Create a community. I mentioned a few times the cognitive diversity is so important, and whether it's your board, your staff, or bringing in outside SME or subject matter experts to work on a project like this, it's really important to have diverse perspectives because you get a much wider range of plausible scenarios to choose from. And then lastly, remembering back to the difference between strategic foresight and strategic planning, this is to be embedded in what you do and practiced regularly with purposeful intent. All right, we just got a few little resources. The first is AGRIP. AGRIP has a multitude of resources on their website available to members, including extensive materials on strategic foresight and generative governance. Rebecca Ryan was the AGRIP futurist that we used, 4 or 5 years ago now. And Rebecca has also a lot of materials on her website. She offers a lot of free and or inexpensive content. She does a thing called Futures Fridays where you can tune in on Friday afternoons, and they'll do an hour on some aspect of strategic foresight. The Institute for the Futures in California, they've been around a little more than 50 years. I completed a futures thinking specialization program through them last year. I finished it in January of 21, actually. It took about 5 months. It's a 5-part course. It's free. With the exception of a Coursera subscription that costs $50 a month. So it's a very good introduction to strategic foresight. And then lastly, of course, I listed myself. I am happy to chat with any of you if you'd like to talk further about strategic foresight and what it can do for your pool. All right, with that, I think we'll move right into our live Q&A.